Next from Springfield, we attend a hearing of the House Education Funding Task Force and hear from representatives of the task force and a representative of Northern Illinois University discuss the effects of the Education Funding Reform Bill, SB 1. This runs about 35 minutes.
So here we are in our education funding task force, and I think we will start with the focus on Senator Menard's this year's Senate Bill 1, a bill that passed the Senate last year, did not come to a vote in the House. I know there have been some changes in the bill, and I think we're going to ask Jonathan Ford to start the discussion with that in mind. We're also going to ask Diane Rutledge to come and talk about Vision 2020. The focus of the group should be how, if at all, we should change the way we fund public education. I think the twin goals are equity and adequacy. How do we do a good job for all of our kids? But how in particular do we make sure that the children who come from areas that are not wealthy, not able perhaps to foot an adequate bill, what's our responsibility to help them? And I think Senate Bill 1 offers a pretty good start, but that should not be the only focus of our discussions. So I'm going to ask Representative Pritchard, who is the minority spokesman, if he'd like to say a few words before we turn things over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. On your previous note about retirement, I didn't think anything was pending. I thought you had lots of objectives and vim and vigor yet to go, so we're not looking forward to that day. But to this issue at hand, it's certainly one that has had a lot of discussion. If you go back in our history all the way to 1818, we struggled with the way that we fund education in an adequate and equitable way. And we're still trying to achieve that goal. Clearly, where we are today does not achieve that goal. And I was somewhat disappointed that when the Senate task force convened, the House did not appoint any members to that. So I'm glad to see that the Speaker has decided it's appropriate that the House engage in a dialogue and look at what has been given in testimony, what we have learned from various school districts on the impact of SB 16, and soon to find what will happen with SB 1, so that we can move closer to that issue of adequacy and equity. I look forward to working with you and hearing lots more testimony. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ford.
Madam Chairman, members of the committee, I'm John Furr with Northern Illinois University. I provided technical assistance to Senator Menard on the drafting of Senate Bill 16 and now Senate Bill 1. My goal for the discussion, I know you have a PowerPoint that's been handed out that describes the bill, is to provide you the information on the major components of Senate Bill 1, to also provide a comparison to the current state funding formula, and to explain some of the key differences between Senate Bill 16 from last year and Senate Bill 1 this year. But just in terms of background, so you all understand the process that led to Senate Bill 16 and Senate Bill 1. In July 2013, that's when the Senate voted to create the Education Funding Advisory Committee with the understanding that it was time to review how public education funds are spent in our state. There were seven meetings of that committee from its designation through the report that was issued in early 2014. The committee's deliberation and the members who came before it and their materials are all posted on ISB's website if you'd like to review those in more detail. In February 2014, it's when the committee released its recommendations for a new state education funding system. Those were recommendations. There were some details associated with those, but there was certainly more work to develop those into an actual bill. So that was the work that happened between February when the report was issued and April 1st, 2014, was taking those recommendations, drafting those in bill form, having that released, and certainly wanting to make sure that there was significant time while the session still occurred for others to review and comment on Senate Bill 16 as filed. There were various changes to the bill that reflected that, and then the bill was passed in May 2014. But just in terms of what Senate Bill 16 and now Senate Bill 1, what it's trying to achieve on the next slide 3, is moving to an integrated primary state funding formula that's accounting for both student need and local resources. And so one major concept is to simplify our current system, which includes some funding going out the GSA formula, others through the supplemental poverty grant, a number of other grants through categorical, through the Chicago Block Grant, simplifying that into an overall integrated formula that would account for approximately 90% of funds that go from the state to local school districts, with some funds that remain in categorical funds, which I'll explain in more detail which ones are excluded from that formula. And also providing then the funding to local districts that still establishes a base foundation level that's intended to meet the needs of all students, but with a weight above that for specific district needs. And the idea is that from a local district perspective, that the amount that would account for that weight for their local needs would establish the overall level of spend. There would be some expectations for state funding for that and local resources, with really state funding targeted to close the gap in what's needed with those local resources to achieve that overall weighted level. But also the concept that districts can continue to spend above that. So if districts choose to be able to raise local taxes to spend above and beyond what that weighted need is, they have the absolute ability to do that, and that's not changed by this bill. One of the other ways to look at that on slide 4, just to look at local need again, this concept that you start with a base amount that accounts for all students' characteristics, you begin to provide an additional weight above that for student need, and then in terms of how state and district funding is allocated to address that need, it's really dependent on local resources. So when you look at slide 4, the district on the far right would be one where for certain student needs that might have previously been accounted for through categorical funds that didn't take account for local property wealth, that district would be expected to account for some of that need with its own resources. So that's one of the major changes with the Senate Bill 16 and Senate Bill 1 funding structure, is having that expectation that local resources begin to address those needs. So for those who might prefer a more formulaic approach, on slide 5, this really lays out the distinction between our current general state aid formula and the proposed primary state aid formula that's in Senate Bill 1. So the current formula provides for general state aid with the overall foundation level, subtracting out available local resources per pupil, and then multiplying that number by the average daily attendance for the school district. And there's certain funding parameters for the alternate formula, and also a flat grant for all districts if the local wealth is at 175% of the foundation level. So the major change with the primary state aid formula is within the calculation of primary state aid having a weighted foundation level. So rather than using the base foundation level, there's a weighted foundation level where you still subtract out the available local resources and then multiply that by the average daily attendance. There's still the concept of a flat grant, which is incorporated more based on a percentage of the foundation level rather than a fixed dollar amount, but that concept still applies. And then when you go to slide 6, that describes how that weighted foundation level is calculated. So that's taking the foundation level times a district weighted average. And that district weighted average is going to range depending on the specific student needs within that district, from just above 1.0 to up to 1.9 or so, depending on the needs within that particular district. And that's calculated by taking that 1.0 number times additional weights on a cumulative basis based on particular student characteristics. One of the changes that was made in Senate Bill 1 from Senate Bill 16 is to add a regionalization factor, to begin to apply that to weights to account for the fact that costs within our states vary by regions. So that was some of the comments that we heard through the Senate Bill 16 process, that there needed to be an account for regionalization. So that is factored in using the National Center for Education Statistics data, which looks at wages outside of the education sector, which is really what drives the local costs for their teachers and for their workforce, are those wage amounts. To go through a little bit more of the math on slide 7 for the additional weights, so you really understand how the numbers work. There are weighting factors for various categories of students. For English language learners, for example, the weighting factor is 0.0. So if you had a school district that had an ELL percentage of 30%, then the math to figure out how that would apply in the formula would be taking 0.20 times 0.3, equaling 0.06, that would be added to that 1.0 figure. So that's the basic math for determining the weighted formula for each district. and then you perform that math for each of the different student characteristics to determine what each district's weight is. So with Senate Bill 1, every school district in the state will have their own weighted amount based on their own student characteristics, with transparency around how that was determined and how funding is flowing out based upon those specific weights. Just to highlight some of the changes from Senate Bill 1 to Senate Bill 16 for the low income percentage, there's a weight that ranges from 0.25 to 0.75 depending on the low income concentration, and that's really because research shows that as low income percentages increase within a school district, there are additional costs and needs a school district has to address because of the concentration of poverty for those needs. So that's maintained. For how low income is counted, though, one of the changes that was proposed in Senate Bill 16 was to base that on the count of 185% of families that are at 185% of the federal poverty level. And that's the equivalent number that's used for free and reduced price lunch. What we found, though, in running the numbers of that is that that was not what ISB would call investment grade data that they had, because there have never been any sort of stakes that's been tied to that particular data. So there were a number of school districts that did not have accurate low income counts as a result of the use of that number, as opposed to what's in the current state aid formula, which is based on families participating in various DHS programs. So what's proposed in Senate Bill 1 is maintaining the current way to count low income for several years, while there's an effort to ensure that there is better data that's tied to the free and reduced price lunch count of 185% to make sure the districts aren't penalized based on bad data there. One of the other changes which is made in Senate Bill 1 for special education, Senate Bill 16 had an assumed percentage for every district in the state of 13.8% based on the overall state average. That was really done to make sure that there wasn't incentives within the funding formula to have more students characterized for being identified for special education than was necessarily appropriate based on those needs. And there could be many districts that in fact can have strategies which are educationally sound to reduce their IEP count by working with students before they may be designated. But one of the things that we heard that there are districts throughout the state, though, that have legitimate reasons for having higher than average state percentages for special education, whether it's either associated with the low income concentration in their district or whether it's associated with the special education services that they might offer within that district. So one of the things that the bill now does is allow districts to work with the State Board of Education to verify a higher percentage than the state average and to have that be counted as part of their count for the state formula. Just to stay moving to the actually before I move to the next slide, there's a couple of other weights that I do want to address as well. We do have weighting that is tied to outcomes, which as far as I know, we're the only state that actually has done that within the funding formula. Specifically, there is weighting that's attributable to students that receive AP scores of 3 or higher or that receive dual credit. We also have weightings associated with students that are career pathway completers. So again, it's looking at how can we begin to have weightings within the funding formula that are addressing certain outcomes, which we know help to prepare more students for college and for careers. And as I said before, I believe that we're the only state that has those types of weights that are specifically incorporated within its overall funding formula. To move to a little bit more details on special education, this is one area where it's important to understand what's in the proposed formula and what's out of the proposed formula. So within the proposed formula, there are 3 existing line items that are fully incorporated. The children requiring special education services line item, which is generally based now on a census-based approach. It's not based on an actual student count with special education. There's personnel reimbursement line item, which again is currently based on the number of staff within a district that are providing special education services, and the summer school services line item. Those are incorporated within the new funding formula. But there are 2 important exclusions from the funding formula for special education transportation and for private placement for students that have particular special education needs that cannot be served by the school district and need to be placed outside the school district to meet those needs. So those would remain categorical line items separate from the formula, and that's really based on the fact that the particular needs that a district might have for special education or for high need placements don't lend themselves very well to formulaic treatment. So whether or not they have to provide transportation services to students will depend in part on the geography and the structure of the school district where they provide those services and those particular student needs. And certainly that's the case for private placements as well. So those were two areas where it was, in structuring the formula, the proposal was to keep those excluded and basically keep those line items as they're currently structured. There are, within Senate Bill 16, there are various hold harmless provisions and phase-in provisions which are included within the bill to make sure that we're addressing the impact of this shift within the formula. One of the adjustments, and these are detailed on slide 9, is the PTEL adjustment, which is currently within the general state aid formula. And I'll talk through the general overview of the PTEL adjustment, but I know that we have experts here at the State Board that can get into much more detail about that as needed. But generally, what the PTEL adjustment does within the general state aid formula is currently accounts for the fact that tax cap districts cannot avail themselves of all their local resources that would otherwise be included within the formula. Because we talked about before that available local resources is a key driver of the funding that school districts receive. So for tax cap districts, what the formula does now is currently substitute in a PTEL EAV, which accounts for the fact that they are tax cap, sort of substitutes a fake lower EAV that is intended to be more equivalent of the actual amount of their local resources that they can tap into. So that's a current adjustment that we have in state law. So that adjustment remains with Senate Bill 1 as proposed. One important change, though, that's done is to add a PTEL EAV floor. And that ensures that the EAV that's used for PTEL adjustments never falls below 85% of a school district's actual EAV. Because remember, the lower EAV, the lower local resources you have, the more money you get out of the formula. So this begins to make sure that there is a closer connection to the actual EAV when that PTEL adjustment is made, which will help to control costs going forward with that PTEL adjustment amount. There have been criticisms about the transparency, about the amount of the formula that's being attributable to PTEL adjustments, and Senate Bill 1 ensures that those are clearly reported out to provide transparency about what's being used for that adjustment and what's being used for other formula payments. There is a new concept within Senate Bill 1 for a hold harmless adequacy grant. And that is addressing the fact that there were various districts throughout the state that were relatively low spend, but also relatively high tax, that for various reasons were losing funding under the change within this bill. So the adequacy grant is targeting funding through a hold harmless approach for those districts where, in comparison, based on their operating expense per pupil to other districts, are fairly low spenders, but also have an operating tax rate that's higher than the statewide weighted average. And as some of the preliminary analysis begins to show that many of the outliers that were talked about as for the Senate Bill 16 process would be addressed as part of this adequacy grant process and some of the other changes within the bill. The loss cap that was in Senate Bill 16 continues on with Senate Bill 1 at $1,000 per pupil loss cap, although at the recommendation of the State Board of Ed, not having that in perpetuity, but having there be an eventual sunset for that loss cap. Obviously, if more funds are put into the formula over time, then that would not be an issue for those districts. And finally, there's a phase-in approach for having decreases and increases from the base year phased in over 3 fiscal years. So if you are a quote-unquote winner with Senate Bill 1, those amounts would be phased in, and the same with those who would be losing funds. The last area that I want to touch on quickly is for oversight and accountability. There are a number of provisions in Senate Bill 1 that ensure that there is necessary support for various student populations and transparency around how funds are spent. There is specific funding which is provided for ISB for staff and contractual services related to support for ELL and special education students. For all school districts, there will be complete transparency about what their weights are, how those are attributable to different student populations, and the amount of funding, both at the state and the local level, that is exactly attributable to those student populations. For English language learner students, there was some concerns in Senate Bill 16 that some of the current accountability processes for budgeting around ELL populations was lost. So that's been reinstated to make sure that there is transparency about how student supports are being provided for those students. And then also for certain districts that aren't making academic progress benchmarks, ensuring that their budgeting for student populations will relate to student needs within those areas. One of the last areas that I'll touch on for school-based budgeting is one important shift within the bill as well, within the second year, moving to a system where ISB can begin to work with districts to account for revenues and expenditures at the individual school level, because we find that throughout our state, some of the within-district disparities are as great as some of the disparities that we have across districts. So I know that was significant information that I provided on the mechanics of the bill. I'm happy to answer questions and know that you'll be receiving some other perspectives as well.
Thank you very much. Questions for Mr. Furr? Nobody with a question? Nobody? I have a quick question, and that is when you first introduced Senate Bill 16, it then was, the way special education operated was quite different from the way it's described today and different from the way the bill finally was when it passed the Senate. That is to say, I thought you had private tuition residential as part of the larger formula rather than splitting it out.
Yes. Madam Chairman, so when the bill was initially introduced, there was a separate issue that was included within the bill as filed, trying to address a current discrepancy in state law and how districts are reimbursed for high-cost students depending on whether or not they're served in district or out of school district. So currently, if a school district is choosing to place a student outside the school district who is a high-needs special education student, they're basically reimbursed once they're above 2 times their per capita amount for expenditures for that student. And for within district, it's at 4 times, so they're actually incentivized to do out-of-district placements. And so as filed, there was discussion about trying to equalize that treatment of in-district and out-of-district. There was significant discussion and concerns given that the funding was still suggested to be outside of the primary state aid formula. It's really a somewhat separate issue as it remains a categorical spend, but was an issue that I believe on the Senate side they decided was not right for action.
Representative Bradley.
I'm of the belief as downstate Southern Illinois, only Southern Illinois, deep Southern Illinois representative on this panel, I'm of the opinion that a child in Marion and the value of their education is worth as much as anywhere else in the state. That's not the case under the system we have currently. My children are not given the same value of education as children in the other parts of the state. And so my question to you is, and as we move forward in this process, is does your proposal fix that?
Yes. Well, that I think with this proposal, it certainly begins to address the fact that we have limited state dollars to spend on how children are educated throughout the state. So it's about 25% of the money that's spent on children within our state comes from the state. So the rest, 65%, is based on local resources, 10% federal. So what Senate Bill 1 does is really targets that spending to where it's needed the most, to those districts that do not have the local resources to provide the education needed based on their individual student populations. So yes, we do move to a system that looks at student characteristics, funds based on that need, and also truly accounts for the local district ability to pay.
But it's not equalized.
In terms of there is the regionalization factor, but
It's not equalized. It may be a step in that direction, but it's not equalized, right?
well, it's a step toward that direction. But I think that there will always, there will certainly still be discrepancies.
You'll do better in here just answering questions
Yes.
directly.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Ives.
Thank you. Does Senate Bill 1 actually set out the foundation level like Senate Bill 16 did?
Yes, the foundation level is treated the same so that it
Do
would.
you put a number to it? Because in Senate Bill 16, they had a number that was lower than the 6119 level.
So the Senate Bill 16 had 6119 in the bill. However, that would be reduced based on the amount of appropriation. And so the reason for doing that now, we have a foundation level number in law, but if the appropriation is lower than what's needed to fund that, proration occurs.
Right.
So when that happens outside the formula, that begins to have very different impacts for districts depending on the amount of state funding they're
Now, I
receiving.
specifically remember that the foundation level in Senate Bill 16 was significantly, like 5,200 is what they started with.
Well, that was based on, because the foundation level is lower
assumed
based on the actual.
proration?
That assumed a lower appropriation, that assumed current appropriation levels, and that was the adjustment down.
Okay. Also, did you, in terms of defining what are available local resources, does it also include that Chicago gets to subtract out its pension payments?
It does.
That's
Right.
still in there?
Yes.
That they get to subtract out their pension payments as part of their available local resources?
Right, as the one district that's making that payment on behalf of its teachers, right?
Well, what
that's
about other
covered for.
districts that make they make a pension payment too? They make 0.58%, or they're supposed to.
Well, in terms of the specific amount that's attributable to Chicago for being subtracted, that is a payment that only Chicago.
Only
is
Chicago
taking.
gets it, and no other district gets it, even if they make a pension payment?
Like I said, in terms of the dollar amount that's attributable for Chicago's resources, that is only in law the responsibility of
Chicago.
Chicago for making that payment. For
They haven't
other
corrected that.
districts, that payment is made on their behalf by the state.
That's going to be a problem. Thank you.
Representative Tryon.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. After I run everything through my decoder ring, we're still not sure what our questions are, but the tax cap and the PTEL adjustment, provides the formula some a difficult time adjusting everybody, I think, equally. For instance, the PTEL was designed to protect a property taxpayer in a time period where the EAV was exceeding the CPI. I don't think the framers of the tax cap ever anticipated a time where the EAV would be declining and the CPI would be going up. And that's the situation we found ourselves in, primarily in the suburbs since '08. In certain areas in the suburbs have taken drastic devaluation of real estate, has driven the tax rates in some cases up drastically, so that you now have, I've given my house as an example, I'm living in about a $220,000 house as it's assessed. I'm paying over $7,000 in property taxes, and 68% of that's going to the school district. So my rate's being driven up, and then we're in Representative Bradley or downstate districts where they actually are at their statutory caps, with tax rates. Then we might have another district that might be, and I can use Chicago as an example. I think last year their tax rate was $2.58, $2.60. And that, how is that factored in? There's a tax burden applied to the real estate taxes locally that I'm not sure is being reflected in the state aid adjustment based on the taxpayer's ability to pay.
Right. Well, in terms of the treatment of the PTEL, either uses the PTEL EAV is determined in the formula, which accounts for that ratio increase, or the actual EAV, whichever is lower. So if a community's the local property wealth would fall below whatever that assumed adjustment is under PTEL, you would be using the actual information as part of this adjustment, so they would be getting more funding if they were actually losing dollars below
But
their PTEL.
that would happen if you had rapid inflation and you couldn't get all the dollars, right? I'm talking about we've been experiencing rapid deflation,
right?
And the tax rates are going up, and the burden felt by each taxpayer is way different in the state. That's why in the suburbs, when we start talking about the former Senate Bill 1, it was very, our Senate Bill 16. It was just a showstopper. You couldn't place any more property tax burden on the property taxes in the suburbs because, the rates now are $5, $6, $7 per $100 of assessed value in comparison to many districts where the rates were substantially less. In fact, I could use Danville as an example. In the year 2000, they got $2,600 a child. Under the current formula, they're getting about $7,600 a child. So the formula actually did its job. It provided more resource to that school district. I have a school district that's District 158. They're only spending $8,800 per child. And here's a school district getting almost 100% of what my school district is. They're actually spending more to educate a child there than I'm spending here, but my tax burden is way up here. And that's going to be the problem and the conflict we have if we're just going to talk about equity funding. So I mean, and somehow we have to get our arms around that. Either there has to be more than a hold harmless, there has to be some evaluation of the tax burden and how much that should be too.
Right. And I think there was the acknowledgement with Senate Bill 16 and Senate Bill 1 that there's a limit to what can be achieved through school funding formula changes and other issues that do have to be tackled through the tax code. And so there are structures that are in place for kind of ongoing review of the PTEL adjustments and making recommendations, but also understanding that some of those issues truly will need to be addressed through tax code processes, which we didn't try to tackle through this particular bill.
There are some school districts that have high EAVs and low rates, you know, and get lots of state aid. I guess that's my point. And somehow we got to get our arms around that, and we're all going to have different issues in our districts, and we have, I think, a big problem, and we need to work on it. And you know, I would like to also think that we'll have a conversation about you know, best practices and adequacy. And I would say 50 years ago, an education in my school district and an education in Representative Bradley's district looked a lot similar than it does today. And you know, we have technology is way different. We have school districts that aren't able to offer chemistry, things like that. So, you know, I think adequacy and tax burden are two things that have to also, I think, be a part of judging how much money goes someplace.
Yeah.
Representative Pritchard.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In all of the discussion that's gone into SB 16 and SB 1, has there ever been much discussion about changing the reliance on funding education through the property tax?
You know, that I think with this proposal and the recommendations that came back from the EFAC committee, that from what came through that committee, there was always the intention to make sure that there would be an accounting for local resources as part of that, and knowing that in terms of making, again, a shift to where a percentage substantially larger than 25% of local education spend, and to have much more of that to come from the state would require much more massive structural changes than are even proposed through this bill. So, you know, in terms of my specific role really came in around the drafting bill stage. I'm not sure what all the alternatives were that came into the EFAC recommendation, but at least what came out of that committee wanted to keep some same fundamental concepts around how you account for available local resources, but just accounting more for that in more funding categories and adding the student weighting components.
Well, I mean, I certainly see the need to look at the needs of a district to educate students and the challenges those students bring. But all of this seems to be predicated upon the property tax, which Representative Bradley mentioned just is a real issue when you get downstate and property values have really diminished. So the only way you're going to get at some degree of adequacy is looking at other forms of funding to bring the revenue that's necessary to educate the students where they are today. So I just wanted to see if there had been any real discussion on that issue in all of the debate that's gone on in the Senate so far. Thank you.
I think the answer is no. The parameter was stick with the current ratio of funding between property taxes and state funding, and then see what you can do about equity. So
Right.
I think that's an important discussion to have, Representative. I wish we would, but I think that was not part of the discussion about Senate Bill 16 or 1. Representative Fortner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I apologize if this came up. We had to go to committee for 10 minutes, so I apologize getting up in the middle of your presentation as well. One of the things I observed as the impact in Senate Bill 16 is that there were some thresholds that created some unusual effects. And in particular, there was an effect where a district where 3/4 of the students in the high school district, a dual district, 3/4 of the students in the high school district were served by one middle school. The way the formula worked out, you could have an eighth grader from that middle school, which had a significantly large low-income population, where the formula actually gave them a huge boost of thousands of dollars per pupil under SB 16. They would walk 3 blocks to the high school, and the state support would drop to $165. Merely because another 25% of the population came from other areas. And it appeared to be just because of arbitrary thresholds, and I wonder if that has been corrected in SB 1.
Well, one of the major issues that I had talked about was how the low-income percentage was being counted. And so we were proposing a shift in Senate Bill 16 from a current count based on DHS programs to a count based on the same number used for free and reduced price lunches. Now, free and reduced price lunch data at the high school level is notoriously inaccurate for various reasons, because high school kids don't sign up, their parents don't get involved. And so there were many districts who were seeing a significant loss in funding because of that bad data issue. So that is an issue that we have fixed by maintaining the DHS percentage going forward, and at least with some of the anomalies that were part of Senate Bill 16, particularly for those high school districts and the others, kind of the preliminary review of what the impact would be for Senate Bill 1, those were addressed.
So what you're saying is that this fix would make it so that they would use the K-8 numbers and project them forward to the high school, or how does that work then?
They would continue to use the same numbers that are being used for the poverty grant, which is based on the percentage of families within their boundaries that are participating in DHS programs.
Okay, so it's based now, and would that apply to both K-8 districts as well
Yes.
as 9 to 12s?
Yes,
Okay, so none of them would be based on the free reduced lunch?
correct.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? I just have one quick one. I didn't quite understand the import of the question having to do with who's making pension payments, but my understanding, and I certainly could be dead wrong, is that the state doesn't require districts outside the city of Chicago to contribute to the teacher pensions.
Correct.
But
Correct.
Chicago does
Is
pay
required,
for
correct.
not only the state pension, downstate teachers, but also we pay for our own. Some districts may decide to pick up employee contributions to the pension system, but they're not required by state law to do so.
Correct.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Furr.